worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." In the name of one God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer of our lives. Amen. We have a story of the tumult of a sea, the Sea of Galilee or the Lake Gennesaret. It's called both things. We have the story of Jesus saying, "Do not be afraid." And then it's a story of two guys trying to walk on the water. At the heart of the story, it's a story about fear and how we navigate fear. It's got me thinking about fear and the things I'm afraid of. It makes me wonder, what are you afraid of? Often our fears are unconscious, or we avoid thinking about our fears, or we spend a lot of our energy defending ourselves against the things that we're afraid of. And sometimes if we're courageous, we actually step into our fear and confront them. I know for myself, I've always been afraid of heights, and so I'm afraid of being on a rock face, on the face of a cliff and falling. And so I've gone rock climbing, and even though I'm belted up with a rope, I'll be on the side of the rock face, and my fears kick in. And it's a totally, you might say it's an irrational fear, but it's a fear that makes a lot of sense, why you would be afraid of falling off a rock face. I'm also one of my phobias is swimming in water that's murky, that I cannot see. So a natural body of water like a lake or a river where I cannot see the bottom, I freak out. Because I'm expecting this giant squid to come and get me at any moment. I watched 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when I was a kid, and even though my rational mind tells me there is not a giant squid in this little lake here in the mountains, something deep in my mind is telling me that I need to be afraid. It's a curious thing. I used to be afraid of bears in the woods, going backpacking, until I was on a trip by myself, and I actually encountered a bear walking up a trail towards me, and I survived, and then now I'm not afraid of bears anymore. But there are deeper fears that plague us all, and I know that plague me. I'm afraid of debilitating illness or catching some sort of illness that will rob me of my abilities. I'm afraid of having my identity hacked on the computer. I'm afraid of, things falling apart politically or economically, having our world turned upside down. I'm afraid of somebody trying to come in and steal my stuff, even though I don't have a lot of stuff. We do a lot of things to defend ourselves against our fear, like we put in home security systems and we lock our doors and we have good locks, right? We've found ways to help ourselves mitigate the fear. These guys are afraid. They're on a boat. When we go out on the water, we still feel the force of the water, but we have nautical charts and tide tables and good boat design that helps protect us, and life vests, and we follow weather reports. We have so many things that help us navigate the powers that are beyond our control. And we've even done it with illness. I'm afraid of COVID. I'm afraid of catching COVID. But when I compare what we're going through right now compared to what it was like when people were experiencing the plague or, typhoid or, dysentery or any of the other kinds of things, the Spanish flu even, back when people didn't understand what was going on. Like, they didn't understand how the illness was spread, and so they couldn't figure out how to protect themselves. All that they knew is that all of a sudden somebody would get ill, and then they would die, and then some people would contract it and other people wouldn't contract it, and there was a randomness to it, and it prompted a lot of fear. And we feel fear, but gosh, we figured out the DNA sequence of this virus pretty quickly after, it was discovered. And then, we studied what impact it does to the body, and we figured out how to avoid spreading it to each other. We know that if you wear masks and you wash your hands and you socially distant and you stay away from large crowds and in enclosed spaces, you're actually going to probably be okay. That's one way of mitigating the spread. And still, it haunts us. Still it has a power that has kind of transformed us and forced us to change our behavior patterns in ways that, many of us are still coming to grips with. What are you afraid of? Like, what are the things that haunt you? What are the unconscious fears? In the ancient world, they were afraid of the sea. They were afraid of the power. I mean, the boats that they had were, these wooden boats that they put together, and boats that could be tossed around if the waves were high enough in the wind. So they saw the sea as being chaos, right? And in the ancient Babylon, the goddess of chaos was called Tiamat, and she was the goddess of the ocean. She was the primeval chaos from which all of the world was created. It makes a lot of sense in a worldview that you're confronted with this power that you don't understand, that seems beyond your control, that will tear you apart. You would think that chaos lies at the heart of things. I mean, the Jewish people, wrote their creation story. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters, right? They have the Spirit of God hovering above the chaos. This wind blowing, it's almost as if God is walking on the water, walking on the chaos. And God says, let there be. And God starts sorting it out. He starts separating the land from the sea, and the light from the darkness, and the night from the day. And he puts stars and planets, and it is good. And the point is that chaos doesn't have control. It's actually God who has control, and it's God who gives order, and it is good. So today's story, today's gospel story, that's what Jewish folks would have had in mind, in those early Christians. Our God is the God who hovers above the waters of chaos. Our God is the God who puts order in the midst of the chaos, and it is good. The gospel text begins with immediately, which makes you wonder, well, what was happening right before it? And I think what was happening right before it was that it's our story from last week, where there had been this banquet at Herod's palace, a birthday party, and because of envy and jealousy and power plays, John the Baptist gets beheaded, and his head is brought into the banquet on a platter. It's a gruesome, awful story. And Jesus hears of it, and he goes by himself to grieve, and these crowds follow him. And Jesus is, he has compassion on them. His guts are churning, and just out of a sense of the suffering that they're going through. And he spends a day healing them. And at the end of the day, the disciples are like, send them away. They're worried, they're afraid that they don't have what it takes to feed the people. And they beg Jesus, send them away. And Jesus is like, you give them something to eat. And all they know is their scarcity. All they know is their inadequacy. And they say, well, all we've got is 2 loaves and 2 fish, or 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, that's enough. Bring it here. So then he blesses the food, breaks it, and distributes it, and everyone is filled, and there's 12 baskets left over, 1 for each disciple. They learn that they're enough. And then immediately, that's where today's text begins. Immediately, Jesus sends them away. He sends the disciples into a boat to go onto the other side of the shore. I mean, the crowds are still there. And Jesus makes the disciples get into a boat to leave. He separates them from the crowd, which is very curious, before he then dismisses the crowds, which is how it begins. There's something about that moment of them having stepped into this transcendent moment where they were stuck in their own sense of their own scarcity, and he sends them away. They have this experience of the abundance, and it's almost like Jesus wants to protect them from that moment and recognizes how vulnerable they are after a moment like that and sends them away on this boat. And then Jesus dismisses the crowds. Jesus sends them away, and then he goes by himself to pray, and he prays throughout the night. And he's by himself. And then early in the morning, right? I mean, the disciples actually, a wind comes up, and the disciples are not able to get onto the other side. And so all night long, the disciples are in this boat in the tumult of the Sea of Galilee as the wind is stirring up these waves, and they don't have an electric or gas motor. I mean, all they've got is they need the wind, and yet the wind is unnavigable at this point, and they can't row against the force of the waves, and they're living there in the sense of their own powerlessness. I mean, they're afraid. They're confronted with the forces of nature that are beyond their control. And Jesus, early in the morning, right, this is before sunrise, he's aware. And he moves towards them in the midst of their chaos. They're caught up, right, in the chaos, and he moves towards them. And he walks on the chaos. Right? He transcends the chaos and he walks on the chaos towards them. And when they see him, they think that something supernatural, in addition to the force of the water, they think something darkly supernatural has come towards them, and they're terrified that he's a ghost. And Jesus says to them, they cry out. I mean, the text says that they cry out in fear. They're howling in fear. And Jesus says, take heart. Take heart. Return to yourselves. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. It was a powerful moment for them. He calls them out of away from their focus on the tumult that's in front of them, on the chaos, on the terror, on the fear, on the insecurity, on the inadequacy. Like he calls them away from that. And he says, I'm here. Look at me. And Peter says to him, well, if it really is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter asks to get out of the boat. He says, if it is you, let me stand on the chaos. Which Jesus doesn't ask him to do that. Jesus never asks him to get out of the boat. Jesus isn't suggesting that you need to kind of surf the chaos here or walk on the chaos. He's only saying, don't be afraid, I am here. But Peter's like, he's bold. There's something audacious about what he's doing. He's saying, let me step into the chaos. And so Jesus says, all right, come. Peter gets out and he's looking at Jesus and he walks on the water. He stands on the tumult, right? He rises above the fear until he senses the wind blowing and he turns his gaze and he sees the swell of the ocean. And he lets the fear come in again. And he begins to sink. He becomes frightened. And he cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand, catches him, gets him back into the boat. He says, you have a little faith. Why did you doubt? Why did you let the fear in again? Why did you shift your gaze and focus on the fear and the chaos and give it power? Look at me instead and trust that I am good.